My story is short, but the time it covers involves several long years. I can't exactly tell you just how desperate I am to find peace over my experience. Finding somebody that will listen without judgment has been a tremendous struggle, and no small part of my frustration. The other part is knowing the sort of evils that run free and the things they do to innocent people that just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I utterly hate confined spaces, and I think that's one of the reasons my older cousin took every chance she could get to get me into a cave with her. It was always a cave, or a closet, or a tunnel, or some small space that we weren't really supposed to be in. She loved to go exploring, and she loved to scare me to death in the process. She was like that as a child, and she stayed that way as she grew older. One day, she finally picked the worst possible place to explore, and she just had to get me involved. She said that she saw a shadow enter a cave in the deserts of New Mexico. We're natives to New Mexico, so the desert doesn't really faze me as much as caverns do. Most of the time, I could hold my breath and explore with her for just a few moments, but that eerie little story was an automatic no for me. Telling her no only made her try harder to persuade me. I don't know how she did it, but she sold me on going into that cave for 5 whole minutes. She said I could set the alarm on my phone if it would help. However, I foolishly agreed. The cave entrance was wide and tall, as was the first chamber we found ourselves in. It was more spacious than I thought, and this lulled me into a false sense of security. A natural tunnel led on, and we went, and I agreed to go, feeling more calm than I should have. We both lit up the flashlights on our phones, and I instantly regretted it. There were skins stretched on the tunnel walls, and symbols painted onto them in some sort of chalky red substance. There was no airflow, but I definitely remember seeing the slightest movement in those same skins, as if by some diabolical means there was still some life in them. They didn't just sway, they were twitching and jerking. I pointed this out to my cousin, but she wouldn't even look. She was far too busy worrying about where the tunnel went next. I was beginning to panic well before the 5 minutes were up. The cavern felt inhabited by something wrong, and if the first tunnel had evil-looking skin that still moved, the rest of the cavern couldn't have anything good. She got too far ahead of me, and I lost her. She traveled well beyond my phone's light. She yelled at me to pick up the pace, but I couldn't. Fear held me back like a lanyard. Suddenly, she was running towards me, but 2 very large gray hands with long and dirty nails closed around her face from behind her. One of the fingernails dug into her eyes, and she screamed as she dragged backwards. That pushed me over the edge. Everything that happened after that felt like a bad movie that I was watching from back of the theater. One of my legs wanted to run after her. One wanted to run to the cave entrance. It was complete mental agony that transcends anything I have ever felt before. I phoned the police and directed them to the remote location of this cavern. They didn't find any of the things I have described to them, not the twitching skins on the walls or anything, and they certainly found no trace of my cousin. I've since tortured myself by driving out to the location of the cavern and just standing nearby. If you've never experienced tragedy up close and personal like that before, then there's no point in trying to explain. It's like the way firefighters and soldiers will stand next to ground zero of the Twin Towers, even to this very day. It took me 3 years, but I finally saw something after all my pilgrimages to that cave. It was near sunset one evening when I saw a shape going towards the cavern at a fast clip. It looked every bit like my cousin. The resemblance struck me so hard that I forgot how to be afraid, and I chased after her in a state that felt somewhat like sleepwalking. I called out to her as I ran for all I was worth to catch her before she went inside. She stopped just long enough to look straight at me and then disappear inside. It was her. It looked just like her. The eyes were bigger and darker than I remembered, but I didn't care. I had found her. It had to be her. I gave in to my foolishness again and bounded after her into the darkness of this cavern. My phone lit the way, and I yelled for all I was worth. There were more skins than there had been 3 years prior. There was some that looked like hooded cloaks. I discovered to my horror that they were indeed human. The hoods were faces. They writhed and twitched in my presence. One of them, I swear, the empty face lifted and looked at me. Even though there were no eyes and no solid support, I recognized it right away. It was my cousin's skin. The mouth stretched and flexed and gaped, and a horrible wail sounded far off, as if her voice were coming from somewhere deep in the cave. I reported all of this too. You can guess how they reacted, judging by how crazy and insane my story sounds. At the time, I was committed to an institution. The irony was that I needed the help after what I'd seen. I can't talk about that experience with just anybody. There's too many people watching me to see if I might need to go back in for treatment. But the encounter is eating me alive, and I don't know why my cousin's skin is hanging on a cavern wall, and why it can scream. I don't know who is walking around with her appearance, and I don't know how long I could stay sane with the knowledge that something awful can happen to any person who ventures around here. My younger brother was really big on illegal hunting. He said that it was more fun when it was something you weren't supposed to be doing. Something about having something to hunt while watching out for being hunted by the law. Either way, he was a man prone to taking self-destructive chances. I went with him as an extra set of eyes. I'm sorry, but you just look out for your little bro. It's just the way it is. Plus, I didn't want him to pick a fight with any animal that's too big for him. He really was the stupid type. You know, the kind that would hit a bear with a stick, just for the thrill of being chased by it. I found out the hard way that you really can't save a man from his stupidity if he doesn't want to be saved. And I've paid with having to live with the memory of what happened. In a strange way, I resent my brother for having no such curse. We were in a West Virginia timber that was as wild as you can get, without it being too swampy. Life of all kinds was everywhere you looked. Of course, my stupid brother was there to shoot something. He wised up a little bit and took up bow hunting, something that requires far more skill than his dumb face could do. After telling him 500 times plus that loud noises draw the heat. He must have finally listened. He spotted an elk that he swore he couldn't do without. Even I had to admit that it was a very impressive animal. At the time, there wasn't a pass on hunting elk. The state was trying to build up their numbers. But this elk was a real looker, and I swear, the thing was looking directly into my brother's eyes. He thought so too, and there was no backing down for him. My brother threw all caution and stealth to the wind, sprinted after the elk, with bow in hand. The animal was very peculiar about my brother. It didn't run. It trotted away, but it made no effort to lose my brother. My brother moved faster than I thought he could ever move, so I had some catching up to do. He had gotten way ahead of me, and I wasn't a young man, not even then. I had to navigate a very steep hillside, full of young trees and saplings, which took me quite a while. My brother got through it like it was his element, which is why I was that much more surprised to see my brother standing at the top of a hill where it opened up into a flat, even glade, where one large tree dominated the center of the opening. I've seen some strange trees in those parts, but this one was like something from another world. The bark was black as tar, and it was bristling with spines long enough to be spears. When I caught up with my brother, he was standing in front of it, looking up into its wicked branches, and I noticed he wasn't holding his bow, and I was going to ask him what he did with it, when I noticed that one large spine impaled my brother through the mouth and erupted from the back of his skull. Somewhere in the fog of shock, I stumbled back just in time for a hunter's arrow to miss me by inches and strike a nearby tree. It was one of my brother's arrows. The bow was in the hands of something that had the elk's head, but everything from the neck down looked entirely human. At least mostly human. The exposed skin was a little too gray with hair, and looked a little coarse, even from the distance that I was. I tried to reconcile what I was seeing with the earlier sight of an actual elk running on four-hoofed legs. Now, there was this actor in a skin suit, and he really did wear a cape of skin. It was like a quilt of patchwork flesh. I think there was more than one animal in that cape too. But the arms and legs didn't quite look right to me. Or maybe the intensity of the moment distorted what I remember. I don't know. Either way, my brother died by his own weapon, shot by something that went from 4 legs to 2 in the blink of an eye. I don't know how that works, and you couldn't pay me enough to go back into that wild wood to find out. I learned that day there are just some things that are meant to be left alone if you know what's good for you. In the meantime, I'm still deep in the process of mourning. Me and my brothers were deep in rural Nevada, and we were photographing everything. When I say we, I mean I. I was the shutterbug. That was back before digital was accessible. I lived for the experience of dropping my film off at Walmart and picking it up a few hours later. We were on the bus to our destination, and it had slowed so we could get a look at the open spaces around us. I saw something that couldn't have been 100% natural. It was a wolf, or a coyote, but appeared to have ruby red eyes, and what I swear had been short antlers of some kind. I didn't ask anybody else if they were seeing the same thing. I was too afraid that it would vanish if I looked away. This is usually the point where something goes wrong with the camera, but mine worked just fine. The animal even looked right at me as I fired off 15 shots. My last few shots coincided with the thing changing shape right in front of me and going from 4 legs to 2. Suddenly, I felt like I held $1 million in my camera. If those shots turned out good, I might be able to supply the world's first concrete evidence of something paranormal. However, the developed pictures came back and revealed nothing. The strange thing didn't even show up on film. Everything that had been around it was shown in crisp and sharp detail. Some of my best camera work, actually. Each one looked like well-composed nature shots. But the subject in the photos were missing entirely, as if they were 100% transparent and were gone, like they had never been there. I'm not quite sure how to explain it either. One of the most terrifying things that I've ever experienced happened just a few months ago. It is also something that I was never able to fully explain. I got a call from my mother to say that my grandma was feeling poorly, and I could run to the store to get her a few things, and then drop them over. My mother was out of town for a couple of days, and so I didn't really mind helping out. I headed straight to the deli and picked up the bits my mom had said to get, and a couple of treats for my grandma. Some of her favorite candy, and a couple of trashy magazines that she really liked reading. It didn't take too long, despite being fairly busy, and soon, I was heading out of the parking lot. It was this one-way system where you'd have to loop past the store to exit and get back onto the road. As I was driving past, I had to do a double take, because standing in front of the store, holding a bag of groceries, was Grandma, wearing her favorite purple leisure suit, and she smiled right at me. Now, the parking lot was backed up, so I couldn't slow down or block the road. I had no choice but to keep going. Although I thought it was very odd that she was at the store when my mother had asked me to go. At that point, I wasn't worried, nor scared. Just confused, I guess. I drive fairly quickly, and I was soon at her house. Her car was parked by the garage, which, again, I thought was kind of strange. She drives at the speed of an old lady. How on earth did she beat me back? My mom had always made sure that my sister and I had the key to their house, and this one, just in case we ever needed to get in. So, I unlocked the door now and called out. Nothing. I let myself in and dropped the keys and groceries on the table. Then, I heard a groan from upstairs. "Is that you?" my grandmother asked. I hurried up there to see her, and there, lying on the bed, in her purple leisure suit, was my grandmother, with one ankle raised up and the size of a Christmas ham. Turns out, she twisted it that morning, which was why she called my mother. She could only just hobble to the bathroom, let alone anything else. There was no way in hell she'd been at the grocery store. So I made her some tea and sat with her for a bit, listening to all the gossip from the neighborhood. I noticed that she had looked real tired too. I asked her if she'd been sleeping okay. It couldn't have been from the ankle pain, since that had just happened. She told me that not too well. Now I was feeling even more confused. See, my grandmother loves animals, but doesn't have any pets since they're a lot of commitment. And since my grandfather passed, she likes to be able to just up and visit family without having to worry too much on who's going to feed her cats. The dog that keeps coming into the yard, she kept talking about. Night after night it comes. I have no idea where it's from, she said, as she has never seen it around. She paused for another moment, trying to decide whether to carry on. I inquired her more and asked her what is it. She told me that this is going to sound silly, but last night she gave it a treat, and she had a funny feeling about it. This thing came right up close to her, and was a whole lot bigger than any other dog she'd ever seen. And then that she remembers distinctly that very moment that she had seen this thing's face, and it was very human-like and had very big yellow eyes. This wasn't a laughing matter, and she seemed genuinely frightened by the entire experience. So, for that, I'm not exactly sure. Although I never mentioned to her seeing her doppelganger at the store, from what she had just recounted. I had a nasty suspicion that she had encountered some sort of skinwalker or shapeshifter who had copied her image. Thankfully, she had never saw that dog again, and both her ankle and general health had recovered after a few days of rest. Why this just happened, I have no idea, but I really have no doubt about what it was. If you're curious, my grandmother doesn't exactly live in town. She doesn't really have much neighbors either. Her backyard is full of rolling pastures filled with thick timber, so she gets all sorts of wild animals. In fact, many times, she's told me that that's more than enough than having her own pet. A few years ago, a buddy of mine suggested we go on a road trip. It was the end of summer, before we headed back for our final years of college, and she wanted to do something fun and spontaneous. So, we threw some clothes in the bag, and off we went. We drove for a few miles, with no real clue where we headed, or even what we might do when we get there. But it didn't matter. This was freedom, and a spur-of-the-moment thing that we'd likely never get the chance again once we were headed off to law and medical school. After driving for around 12 hours straight, we found a motel and crashed for the night. Then, woke up and did it again. By this point, we were headed towards Nevada. We were having great fun, wind in our hair, tunes on the radio, and as it began to get late again, we looked out for somewhere to stay the night. Although we were mainly sticking to the highways, even some of the main routes now were kind of lonely, and we often didn't see another car for miles. We were also careful on the quieter roads to be on the lookout for any wildlife that might wander into the highway. The last thing we wanted was to run over a deer or a coyote. Not only would it likely damage the car, and make a hell of a mess when we were in the middle of nowhere. We were both animal lovers, and the thought of hurting something was abhorrent. So when I first saw the coyote or wolf, I wasn't sure which at first, as it was pretty dark. I was sure to mention it to Callie, who was driving at that point, to be aware of it, and that was all. It seemed to follow us along the road for a bit, as if playing a sick game of chase, but I did think it was kinda cute. I wasn't sure how it was keeping pace, but we weren't going too fast. I suggested that it might have a lot of stamina. Callie began to feel slightly ill and at ease, so she put her foot on the gas to speed up ever so slightly. She was more inclined to acknowledge whether it was a wolf, coyote, or some kind of wild rabid dog. It was a predator, and it was best if we lost it. but we didn't. Callie sped up, and it did too. "What the hell?" she had asked, ramming her foot onto the gas pedal and taking the speedometer up to 70 miles an hour. And it kept the pace, as if we were at a calm walking speed. We were freaking out. There was no way this animal should be able to do this. It was near impossible. I watched the speedometer climb up to 90 and even up to 100 miles an hour, and Callie looking as if she was losing control. And when I dared to glance out the window, it was still there, its face turned towards us. It was huge, much bigger than what I would presume your average canine desert beast would average, and it had bright yellow eyes. They glowed like orbs. I held in a scream, and to this day, I don't know how I managed. I just knew at this speed, I couldn't startle Callie, or we'd wind up in a ditch. Then, all of a sudden, it was gone. She brought the car back down to around 70, and maintained that all the way to the stretch of lights and buildings that also included a Motel 6. We were both absolutely terrified, and it took us some time to be brave enough to leave the car and race over to the motel. Sensing our distress, the guy behind the check-in desk asked if we were okay. Did we need any help? When we told him what had happened, he just nodded and suggested that we find a different route home. Looking at each other, we knew there was no way in hell we'd ever drive that stretch of highway again. Back in high school, I had a really good friend who lived on the res. His folks owned a farm out there, and sometimes I would stay over and help out with chores. I really liked animals, and had wondered about maybe becoming a veterinarian someday. Since the property was surrounded by thick woodland, and their cattle was their livelihood, they had plenty of fencing and traps laid out for any would-be predators, such as coyotes or wolves, something that might try and attack and hurt the herd. One of the neighbors had to have been on the lookout for some sort of mangy-looking coyote, who was obviously getting braver the hungrier it got, as it had been seen straying closer to the properties. I kind of felt a little sorry for it, not liking to think that any creature should be starving, even when that was likely to cause devastation if it was to get into the field. There was also the matter that several of the cows with calf, which made them slower as they were huge, therefore easier prey, and the fact that the family would be losing 2 creatures. So, all this meant they were being extra vigilant and on hyper alert for any evidence that the coyote was planning an attack. Which leads me to the reason that my friend and I were in the field that evening, complete with shotguns, hiding and waiting for the beast to appear. We planned to stay out there for a few hours, probably until we got too cold, and earned some brownie points from his mom. It was just after midnight, getting close to when we would call it a day, when we heard a noise. George's dad had installed security lights, and although it was not exactly lit up like Friday night on a football field, it still gave us an advantage. So, when we saw what we thought was a coyote, George got his trigger finger ready on the shotgun. "Move back," he whispered to me as he aimed at this thing. He fired one shot. The cows started mooing and shuffling about as we craned our necks to see if we'd hit the thing. And that's when, to our horror, this thing stood up on 2 legs, just like a freaking person, and ran off. Although it was much taller than a coyote, which would normally stand on 2 legs. Way, way taller than any dog would ever be able to be. We could see from the illumination from the security lights that this thing was covered in reddish hair, and quick as a flash, it ran. George, seemingly unturned by this development, ran to the perimeter and fired off several more shots. I have no idea if he hit anything. He came back to me, then said we needed to get inside very fast. Waking up his parents, he asked if I wouldn't mind waiting in the kitchen for a moment, whilst he talked to them. I wasn't sure what to think. Had I really just seen a huge red coyote, person thing, standing on 2 feet, and then disappearing at the speed of light? When George came back into the kitchen, he looked frightened. He told me that he wasn't allowed to fill me in on much of it, because it was against tribal lore to share such things with outsiders, no matter how close I was to him and the family. I understood, as his traditions are sacred. All he was able to say was that I wasn't to come back until the place was safe. The creature we had seen was far more powerful and evil than I could ever imagine. I didn't ask any more, but when I got home, you bet I went and searched online. I looked and looked, and the only thing I could find was that of a skinwalker. Is this exactly what we encountered? Or could we have encountered something more demonic? First off, I'm not a professional, and not exactly sure if these are skinwalkers. It was 2019, November I believe. I went hunting with my family, and we own a huge farm. I would love to share where, but have been stalked before, and that's still a fear of mine. Anyway, we set out around 5 in the morning, but that's not important. Later that day, finally, my cousin had shot one, a medium-sized buck, a 4-pointer. It was growing dark as we got the buck into the garage to prepare. Anyway, as we were skinning the deer, the forest grew eerily silent. The only sound was light footsteps in the forest and coyotes howling off in the distance. By the time we finished skinning the deer, it was now pitch black. Just as we were about to leave the garage and go eat dinner, the door got stuck. My uncle was relatively mad and fought with it. He couldn't get the garage door all the way closed, but gave up. So we'd go eat, and then off to bed. I couldn't sleep. Something kept me up. I had the best bed, warm temperatures. Everything was perfect, but I just couldn't sleep. My window was opened, and I was hearing crunches outside. Now, keep in mind, this is about 1 in the morning. I tossed and turned, but nothing. Then the tapping and scratching started on my window screen. I was horrified. I grabbed my phone and shined the flashlight over to the screen. What I saw horrified me. It was the deer we had just skinned earlier. Not I forgot to mention, but this deer had a huge dent in its skull. We had no idea why, but on this imposter, the same dent was in the same place. I was slightly alarmed at the sight, and then I remembered. My window is 6 feet off the ground. I sat there, frozen in fear, and the thing let out a low growl and stared at me. I tried to ignore it, but fear overwhelmed me, and I then fainted. I woke up in the morning and ran over to the garage. The skin was gone. The only thing left was a pool of blood. The deer was still hanging up fine. I ran over to my window, and there were prints. Not deer prints. They looked like footprints, mixed with a deer hoof, and some type of deep indentation that could have been a claw mark. I grew up going to my non-blood related, very close family's friend, uncle's cabin, which was on a lake connecting to many other lakes, which goes into a well-known chain of lakes in that region. Anyway, this was when I was about 9 years old, and I had an extreme fear of being anywhere without my mother, since she was the only one around to take care of me and my siblings. This is because my dad had always been a heavy drinker and on deployment, but luckily not abusive. So, because of this, I was sleeping in the same bed as my mom on the ground floor of the old early 19th century cabin. It was raining outside, and around 1 a.m., I could not fall asleep for some reason. The window on the left of the bed was open with a screen on, and my mother was fast asleep. I looked out the window to look at all the trees outside when I heard it. It sounded like the noise of a cliché monster would make, except this was booming across the entire lake outside the cabin, and since I'd been looking at the trees, I could see the trunks and branches vibrating from the roar that I had heard. Since it was so loud, I had no idea which way it came from, but I knew that I had heard it. When it was only me and my uncle and older brother. This time, I was 12. I told my uncle all about it, and he started freaking out. He had told me that the Native American artifacts and items had been constantly found around that area since long before it became a settled town. Ever since then, I've been able to notice strange things in the surrounding woods and lakes, especially while kayak fishing on my own during the dusk. Just small things, like an animal staring at me through the edge of the woods for at least 30 minutes at a time, and following me when I got to a new spot. On one occasion, I was going swimming out in the middle of the lake. I'd gotten there by my uncle's jet ski, so from far away, it would be semi-hard to spot me. I had been swimming around for 25 minutes when I noticed a man's head bobbing up and down in the water, all while staring at me. He had not been there before, and I hadn't or heard him seen him swim out there. Keep in mind, this is about a half mile from the nearest shore. Needless to say, I got the hell home after watching him for just a couple of minutes, just sitting there. My last experience that I will share was again when I was around 12. I was wakeboarding, which, by the way, is my favorite water sport. It was a gloomy day, so that could have very well contributed to this feeling. But every time I let go of the rope and waited for my uncle to turn around and come get me in that boat, I got the most strong feeling of being watched, more than I ever have in my entire life. I felt it all around me, from the trees, the murky black ice like water surrounding me, and the dark, looming sky. I felt like I was going to be swallowed by the eeriness, to the point that I almost began vomiting. The dark water was so cold, I couldn't even feel my legs. When I got back on the boat, I was shivering, and my uncle had thought the water was really cold, so he stuck his foot in. The water was warm, almost too warm to swim in. I felt the water, and it was warm, which was very different from the water I felt before. The clouds began to clear, and the forest around me began to look normal and warm. I don't usually go swimming anymore or go out alone at the lake to fish by myself. So, long story short, My girlfriend and I were swapping scary stories, and she told me about skinwalkers, which I'd never heard of before. When she told me what they were and showed me a few videos, I immediately thought of an experience that I had right about 8 years ago when I was just 15 and my brother was 12. We grew up in rural northwestern Missouri, a little over an hour and a half north of Kansas City. We had 2 other houses on our road, both about a mile away, but they were both quiet, elderly couples who I've never seen out past dark. All of the houses on our road, mine included, were surrounded by corn and wheat fields and trees on all sides. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard the most awful, blood-curdling scream outside my window. It sounded like a woman being brutally murdered in the road. Her scream was so garbled and desperate. I'm 5'3" and was a 15-year-old girl. So, obviously, I ran to my parents' room to tell my dad she needed help. They said they hadn't heard anything outside, which blew my mind, because it was so loud that it made my very blood run cold. Not 5 seconds later, my brother came running in, saying he was in his room and heard a woman screaming for help outside. At this point, my dad started to get concerned and ran outside. But there was nobody else around. I could usually see headlights through my bedroom window, so we were pretty sure no cars had gone by. There was no way she could have disappeared so quickly, especially judging by her screams. My mom, dad, and little sister, who was 8 years old at the time, never heard a sound, but my brother and I still occasionally talk about it to this day, just because it was so weird and upsetting. My mom swears it was an owl, but I'd heard screeching owls a handful of times while living there, and it was most definitely not an owl. I've been told that mountain lions sometimes make a noise like a woman's scream, but they're incredibly rare in that part of Missouri. Even growing up in the country with a forest behind my house, I'd only seen a mountain lion once in the entire 10 years I lived there. My mom has seen one, once, also in that same time frame, but we've never heard them. So, I guess it could have been a mountain lion, but I still don't think that's what I heard. Just a woman's scream that was way too loud and had something a little off about it. I appreciate any answers anybody might be able to give me. It was a crazy experience, and now that I look back on it, it's spooky, and it rendered me unable to sleep.